In early January 1953, Northern Europe was quietly enduring winter. Along the coast of the Netherlands, Belgium, and eastern England, communities were still rebuilding from the scars of the Second World War. Many towns relied on centuries-old dikes and levees to protect them from the North Sea, but years of neglect and limited resources had left these defenses weak. The relationship between humans and the sea had always been delicate, a balance built over generations, and on this night that balance would shatter. Far to the northwest, near Iceland, a deep low-pressure system began forming on January 29th. Meteorologists of the time recognized it as a fast-developing storm, but weather forecasting in the early 1950s was rudimentary and most coastal residents had no idea what was approaching. This weather bomb intensified rapidly, producing hurricane-force winds that pushed massive amounts of water toward the southern North Sea. The timing could not have been worse. The storm coincided with a high spring tide when the gravitational pull of the sun and moon combined to create unusually high sea levels. The geography of the North Sea acted like a natural amplifier. Its funnel shape, narrowing between Britain and the Netherlands, forced the surging waters into a smaller area, increasing the height of the tide. By the night of January 31st, the sea level in some locations rose to more than 5.6 meters above normal, or nearly 18 feet. The winds continued to lash the surface, creating waves that crashed against fragile dikes already weakened by age and wartime neglect. Communication failures made matters worse. Radio broadcasts were limited, especially overnight, and few warnings reached the people sleeping in coastal villages. In Zeeland, Essex, and Lincolnshire, the residents were unaware that a monstrous surge was racing toward them. Every mile of coastline became a potential disaster zone, and when the water finally struck, it would come with virtually no warning. By the evening of January 31st, the stage was set. Tens of thousands of people would face one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 20th century. The North Sea, long both a source of sustenance and danger, was about to unleash its full fury on Europe, and no one could escape its reach. As darkness fell on January 31st, 1953, the storm surge finally reached the coast of eastern England and the Netherlands. In Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and Essex, the sea did not rise slowly. It surged violently, breaching dikes that had been trusted for centuries. Over 1,200 breaks appeared in Britain's sea defenses, and icy water poured into villages before most residents even realized the danger. In some towns, water levels rose so quickly that people had only minutes to escape or find shelter. On Canvey Island, the rising waves overwhelmed the seawall. Thousands of prefabricated homes built after the war and offering almost no resistance were instantly flooded. Residents scrambled to attics and rooftops, clinging to furniture or each other as the freezing water poured in. In one small village, an 80-year-old woman survived 3 days trapped on her dining table, clinging desperately to life as the tide refused to recede. Entire streets were transformed into rivers of icy water, carrying debris and livestock along with the people who had tried to stay behind. Across the North Sea, the Netherlands faced an even larger catastrophe. Much of Zeeland and the surrounding provinces lie below sea level, protected only by a complex network of dikes and canals. Between 4 and 6 in the morning, as the first light of day approached, the dikes began to fail. Water rushed in with terrifying force, sweeping away houses and farmland in minutes. Entire villages vanished under the relentless surge, while residents fled to higher ground or climbed into attics, praying that someone would come to rescue them. Tragically, the destruction was swift and deadly. People were caught off guard, many trapped in homes or knocked into the frigid floodwaters. Stories of survival were harrowing. Families holding on to one another for hours in freezing water, neighbors carrying each other to safety, and the haunting memory of those who could not escape. By the time the tide began to recede, thousands of homes had been destroyed, and the full scale of human suffering was only beginning to become apparent. By February 1st, 1953, the sun rose on a landscape unrecognizable to those who had fallen asleep just hours before. Towns were submerged under cold, murky waters, and roads and bridges had been destroyed, cutting off communication and complicating rescue efforts. In the Netherlands, approximately 9% of all farmland was underwater, leaving crops ruined and livestock stranded. Across eastern England, around 160,000 acres of land were swamped, including homes, schools, and churches, leaving thousands homeless in the dead of winter. The human cost was staggering. In the Netherlands, 1,836 people lost their lives, while in the United Kingdom, 307 died on land with additional casualties at sea. Belgium, Scotland, and other coastal areas also suffered losses, bringing the combined death toll to nearly 2,500. Entire communities were displaced, and survivors faced freezing temperatures, contaminated water, and the constant threat of disease. Relief agencies struggled to provide food, blankets, and clean drinking water, often using boats to navigate streets that had become canals. Rescue operations were immediate but perilous. In the UK, 30,000 military personnel and volunteers were deployed to help save those trapped in homes or stranded on rooftops. In the Netherlands, local fishermen became first responders, navigating flooded streets in small boats to pull neighbors to safety. Makeshift shelters were set up in schools, churches, and town halls, offering the only refuge from the ongoing cold and wet conditions. The psychological impact was profound. Families had lost everything: homes, possessions, and loved ones. Survivors described waking up to floating furniture, trapped animals, and water gushing through kitchens and living rooms. For children, the terror of clinging to a parent in freezing water was a memory that would last a lifetime. Communities mourned collectively while also beginning the monumental task of cleaning, repairing, and rebuilding in the face of what seemed like an insurmountable disaster. The devastation of the 1953 North Sea flood forced governments and engineers to rethink the way coastal protection was approached. In the Netherlands, the disaster led directly to the creation of the Delta Commission, a specialized task force charged with designing a system capable of preventing such widespread flooding in the future. Over the next 4 decades, this initiative resulted in the Delta Works, an extensive network of dams, sluices, locks, dikes, and storm surge barriers. The Oosterscheldekering, the largest of these structures, spans nearly 2 miles and features massive gates that can be closed to block incoming storm surges, a marvel of modern engineering and a cornerstone of Dutch flood defense. In the United Kingdom, authorities also moved to strengthen coastal resilience. The flood prompted the establishment of the Storm Tide Warning Service, a system designed to provide early alerts to communities at risk of coastal flooding. The event was also the primary catalyst for the Thames Barrier, a massive movable gate system completed in 1974 to protect central London from high tides and storm surges. These projects demonstrated that even after catastrophic loss, human ingenuity could create solutions capable of mitigating future disasters. Beyond construction, the flood influenced planning, policy, and awareness. Towns and cities revised building codes to ensure homes could better withstand sudden flooding. Emergency management procedures were overhauled, emphasizing evacuation plans, emergency shelters, and coordination between military, civil authorities, and local volunteers. In both the Netherlands and the UK, education programs were introduced to teach citizens how to respond in the event of another large-scale flood. The legacy of the 1953 flood extends even today. The structures and systems built in response have successfully prevented major casualties in subsequent storms and serve as a global model for flood management. Engineers and planners worldwide study these projects, applying lessons learned to vulnerable coastlines in Asia, North America, and other regions at risk of storm surges. While the flood itself was a tragedy, it catalyzed a transformation in how humans coexist with the sea, turning disaster into enduring innovation and resilience. The 1953 North Sea flood was not only a story of destruction, but also a testament to human courage and resilience. In the immediate aftermath, communities across the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Belgium faced impossible challenges. Families clung to rooftops for hours, entire towns were cut off by water, and livestock floated helplessly through flooded pastures. Despite the chaos, ordinary people became heroes. Fishermen navigated icy waters to rescue stranded neighbors. Neighbors supported each other through freezing nights, and volunteers from distant towns brought supplies to those isolated by the rising tide. Recovery took months and in some cases years. Entire villages had to be rebuilt from scratch. Farmland had to be drained and fertilized, and infrastructure restored. Governments quickly learned that rebuilding was not enough. Stronger defenses and better planning were essential. The lessons from 1953 led to permanent changes in flood management, early warning systems, and public preparedness programs, ensuring that future generations would be far better protected. The human cost was sobering. Nearly 2,500 people lost their lives, but the experience forged a stronger, more united response to natural disasters. Communities that survived the flood retained vivid memories of the event, passing down stories of survival and heroism to ensure history would not be forgotten. memorials were built, and annual commemorations honor both the victims and the bravery of rescuers. Today, the North Sea coastlines are safer thanks to massive engineering projects like the Delta Works in the Netherlands and the Thames Barrier in England. Yet the flood remains a stark reminder of nature's power and unpredictability, showing that even in highly developed regions, human life can be profoundly vulnerable to the forces of the sea. The 1953 North Sea flood continues to inspire scientists, engineers, and emergency planners to innovate and prepare, turning a devastating catastrophe into enduring lessons of resilience, foresight, and human ingenuity. The disaster didn't happen all at once. It began quietly with the first heavy rains of the 2024 rainy season in West and Central Africa. By March, rivers in Ghana and other countries in the region were already swelling, sending early warnings of flooding into communities downstream. Forecasters had predicted above average rainfall, but no one could foresee the unprecedented scale of what was to come. By June, early floods had displaced thousands, damaging homes and crops and claiming the first lives of the season. These initial signs were a harbinger of the catastrophe ahead, showing just how vulnerable the region had become to extreme weather. Then, in July and August, the rains intensified into relentless torrents. Countries like Chad, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo were hammered away as rivers overflowed, submerging towns and isolating communities. In Chad, the floods affected nearly 2 million people by late October, prompting the government to declare a state of national disaster. Across Nigeria, rivers broke their banks, turning entire towns into temporary lakes, forcing residents to flee their homes with little more than what they could carry. On September 10th, after continuous heavy rainfall, the dikes at the Alau Reservoir in northern Nigeria collapsed. This single failure sent a wall of water into Maiduguri, a city of over 1 million residents, displacing more than 200,000 people in a single day. The rains did not stop in September as expected. Instead, they persisted through October and into November, ensuring that floodwaters kept rising and communities remained submerged. By the end of October, more than 7 million people across 18 countries had been impacted, with the scale of destruction surpassing the previous year by 40%. The 2024 flood season had become the worst in decades for much of the region, a slow-motion disaster that refused to end. This creeping, relentless deluge marked the first stage of a crisis that would leave millions homeless, wipe out livelihoods, and test the resilience of governments and humanitarian organizations across the continent. The timeline of the floods shows not a single moment of disaster, but a series of escalating calamities, each compounding the next, and each revealing the fragile relationship between people, rivers, and the climate they depend upon. The scale of the 2024 floods was not simply a natural accident. It was the result of a dangerous combination of climate change and human vulnerability. Scientists from the World Weather Attribution Network determined that human-caused global warming made the season's extreme rainfall between 5 and 20% more intense across the Lake Chad basins. The warming atmosphere holds more moisture, releasing it in torrential downpours that overwhelmed rivers and drainage systems. Temperatures in the central Sahel region have been rising 50% faster than the global average, turning events that were once rare into recurring disasters. Human factors worsened the impact. Rapid and unplanned urban growth pushed millions of people into flood-prone areas, while aging infrastructure, from city drainage networks to dams, proved incapable of handling the volume of water. The Alau Reservoir dike collapse in northern Nigeria was tragic but predictable, a failure magnified by years of insufficient maintenance. In cities like Niamey and Lagos, poorly designed drainage and blocked waterways funneled floodwaters into residential neighborhoods, leaving thousands stranded and homes destroyed. Deforestation and land degradation also played a significant role. With fewer trees and vegetation to absorb rainfall, soil quickly turned into runoff, accelerating flooding in both urban and rural areas. Rivers that historically could contain seasonal rains became uncontrollable channels of destruction, sweeping away bridges, roads, and farmland. In essence, the floods were a perfect storm, natural rainfall amplified by climate change, funneled into regions unprepared for extreme weather. The combination of environmental degradation, rapid urbanization, and insufficient infrastructure created a disaster that was far larger than any single factor could have caused. The science behind the catastrophe shows that this was not just a seasonal event, but a stark warning of the increasing vulnerability of West and Central Africa to climate extremes. Beyond maps and data, the 2024 floods left a staggering human cost that will be remembered for decades. Across the affected region, the floods ultimately impacted 7.5 million people, uprooting lives and shattering communities. At least 1,527 people lost their lives, either drowned in fast-moving waters or trapped under collapsing homes, while an additional 4,499 suffered injuries. Entire families were forced to abandon their homes, with 1.7 million people becoming internal climate refugees, navigating flooded roads and unsafe shelters. The scale of displacement overwhelmed both formal and informal support systems. In Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, entire neighborhoods were submerged, forcing residents to seek refuge in schools, mosques, and makeshift camps. The destruction of over 649,000 homes left countless people exposed to the elements, often with no access to clean water or electricity. Children were particularly vulnerable. In Sudan, they accounted for 15% of cholera cases and deaths as contaminated floodwaters spread disease. Beyond immediate survival, the floods disrupted education and healthcare. Schools and hospitals were damaged or destroyed, cutting off access to vital services just when communities needed them most. Contaminated water sources led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, with cholera and diarrhea claiming additional lives. For families, the disaster was a double blow. First, the loss of shelter and possessions, and then the prolonged fight for health and stability. The human toll was compounded by the psychological strain. Survivors faced the trauma of losing loved ones, livelihoods, and entire neighborhoods. Children watched their schools and playgrounds washed away while adults struggled to provide basic necessities amidst chaos. These social and emotional scars, while less quantifiable than death counts or property damage, are just as enduring and define the long-term impact of the 2024 floods on West and Central Africa. The 2024 floods did not just wash away homes, they devastated entire economies and agricultural systems across West and Central Africa. An estimated 960,000 hectares of farmland were rendered unusable, an area larger than the country of Cyprus, just as crops were approaching harvest. This destruction threatened food security for millions, wiping out months of labor and leaving entire communities facing severe shortages. In Nigeria alone, over 315,000 acres of farmland were lost by mid-September, while in Chad, nearly 900,000 acres of fields were submerged under floodwaters. Livestock losses further compounded the economic impact. An estimated 128,000 cattle were swept away, removing a vital source of income, nutrition, and trade for countless families. These losses were not only immediate, but also long-term, as herds take years to rebuild. Infrastructure destruction magnified the crisis. Roads, bridges, and irrigation systems were obliterated, isolating rural communities and slowing the delivery of aid and recovery efforts. Over 1,277 schools and 221 health facilities were damaged or destroyed, depriving children of education and communities of medical care during the height of the crisis. Markets, storage facilities, and transportation networks were also disrupted, creating cascading effects on regional trade and economies. The financial toll of the 2024 floods is still being assessed, but preliminary estimates suggest losses in the billions of dollars, contributing to the already staggering $10 billion in annual climate-related losses across Africa. Beyond the immediate economic shock, the destruction undermined years of development progress, leaving communities even more vulnerable to future disasters. The floods were a stark reminder that the consequences of extreme weather extend far beyond water. They ripple through every facet of life, from food and income to education and health. The most alarming aspect of the 2024 West and Central Africa floods is that they are not likely to be isolated events. Scientists warn that as global temperatures continue to rise, extreme rainfall and flooding will become more frequent and more severe across the Sahel and Central Africa regions. These recurrent climate shocks leave communities with little time to recover, amplifying both economic losses and humanitarian vulnerability. Africa's disproportionate exposure to climate impacts is a stark injustice. The continent emits a fraction of global greenhouse gases, yet its populations suffer some of the most severe consequences. Countries already grappling with poverty, food insecurity, and conflict faced an even harsher reality as the floods magnified existing social and economic fragilities. Displacement, destruction, and disease created a cycle that left millions even more vulnerable to the next disaster. International aid, while critical, remains insufficient to fully address the scale of the crisis. Agencies such as the UN, IFRC, and UNICEF have mobilized relief operations, but logistical challenges and limited funding mean that recovery is slow and incomplete. Communities must not only rebuild homes, but also restore infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and agricultural systems to mitigate future risks. Experts emphasize that long-term adaptation is essential. Investment in resilient infrastructure, improved flood management systems, early warning networks, and sustainable development is critical to prevent similar devastation. The floods of 2024 exposed gaps in planning, governance, and disaster preparedness that must be addressed. Ultimately, the disaster serves as a warning to the global community. The 2024 floods were not just a natural catastrophe, they were a man-made disaster amplified by climate change and societal vulnerability. For the 7.5 million people affected, the memories of submerged homes, ruined livelihoods, and lost loved ones will linger for decades. The waters may have receded, but the lessons remain. Without urgent action on climate resilience and global cooperation, the next flood could be even more devastating. The story of the Teton Dam begins not with disaster, but with a problem as old as farming itself: controlling water. For decades, farmers in Idaho's upper Snake River Plain faced a constant struggle. Spring snowmelt would swell the Teton River, causing destructive floods that washed away crops, while the hot, dry summers that followed threatened to leave the soil parched. The idea of building a dam to regulate water had been discussed as early as 1932, but it took decades of studies and political debate before serious action was taken. In 1962, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation officially approved the project. The Teton Dam was designed to be a modern engineering marvel, 305 feet high, 3,100 feet long, and constructed as an earthen dam with a 17-mile-long reservoir capable of holding nearly 290,000 acre-feet of water. Beyond flood control, the dam promised reliable irrigation for farms and hydroelectric power for local communities. Construction began in 1972, employing a large workforce that moved over 10 million cubic yards of earth and rock. The dam's core was made of compacted silt, intended to be watertight, while layers of sand, gravel, and rock on either side would provide stability. From a distance, it looked like a man-made mountain, solid and permanent. Despite the promise, warning signs appeared early. Environmental groups raised concerns about the impact on the Teton River's trout population, while geologists highlighted instability in the canyon's bedrock. Cracks and fissures in the volcanic rock beneath the foundation were noted, but many engineers believed these could be managed, yet the very ground the dam rested on was deeply flawed, setting the stage for the tragedy to come. The Teton Dam's foundation rested on volcanic rock, a type of welded ash flow tuff left from ancient eruptions millions of years ago. While it looked solid, the rock was riddled with deep vertical fractures, some so large that engineers could not determine their full depth. To address this, the Bureau of Reclamation installed a grout curtain, drilling hundreds of holes into the canyon floor and walls, and filling them with cement slurry to seal cracks. Yet the fractures were far more extensive than anticipated, and the grout could not completely fill them. Adding to the danger was the dam's core material, a fine-grained, wind-blown silt called loess. Though compacted to form a supposedly watertight barrier, this silt was highly susceptible to erosion. Once water found a path, it could carry away tiny particles, gradually carving channels deep within the dam. This process, known as piping, created an internal erosion loop. The more water flowed, the more silt was washed away, and the larger the channels became. By the spring of 1976, as snowmelt filled the reservoir faster than expected, the combination of fractured rock and vulnerable core created the perfect conditions for failure. Water began seeping through the unsealed cracks beneath the dam, slowly reaching the loess core. Engineers noticed small leaks, but the scale of the threat was underestimated. This hidden internal erosion was invisible from the surface, making it impossible to detect the disaster growing inside the dam. Even minor warning signs, such as small wet spots on the downstream face, were treated as routine and manageable. The flaws in both the foundation and the core were compounded by human overconfidence, as many believed the design was sufficient for the reservoir's immense pressure. By June 5, 1976, these concealed vulnerabilities would align catastrophically, setting the stage for one of the most devastating man-made floods in U.S. history. By the morning of Saturday, June 5, 1976, the Teton Dam showed signs of imminent failure. Early that day, a new leak appeared on the downstream face of the dam, this time muddy instead of clear, indicating that the internal silt core was being eroded. Within hours, a second muddy leak formed, and by 9:30 a.m., a large dark wet patch had developed, rapidly expanding as water gushed from the dam's surface. Engineers and construction crews scrambled to plug the breaches with dirt and boulders, but their efforts were futile against the unstoppable internal erosion. As the situation worsened, emergency evacuation orders were sent downstream, though many residents had little time to respond. Bulldozers, working on the dam's crest, were abandoned as a sinkhole opened beneath them, signaling the dam's structural collapse. By 11:15 a.m., officials realized the dam could not be saved, and urgent warnings were broadcast to all communities in the valley. At exactly 11:57 a.m., the Teton Dam failed catastrophically. The wall of earth, 305 feet tall and holding 80 billion gallons of water, disintegrated, releasing a torrent of water traveling over 2 million cubic feet per second. The flood surged down the canyon at terrifying speed, reaching heights of 30 feet in some locations, and picked up debris, trees, and livestock in its path. The valley below transformed into a churning, destructive river, obliterating everything in its course and leaving no time for those in its immediate path to escape. The sheer power of the unleashed water scoured the canyon walls to bare rock and tore through towns downstream. Wilford, Sugar City, and Rexburg faced the worst of the devastation, with homes, farms, and infrastructure completely destroyed. By mid-afternoon, the reservoir was nearly empty, leaving behind a trail of destruction spanning nearly 300 square miles. In total, 11 lives were lost, thousands of livestock perished, and tens of thousands of residents were left homeless as the Teton Dam flood etched itself permanently into the history of American natural disasters. In the hours and days following the Teton Dam collapse, the full scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. The floodwaters carved a path of destruction across the Snake River Plain, leaving nearly 3,800 homes damaged or destroyed and rendering 25,000 people homeless. Livestock losses were staggering, with over 16,000 animals swept away in the torrent or drowned in the floodwaters. Crops were ruined, irrigation systems obliterated, and the fertile farmland that had once sustained the valley was buried under silt, debris, and mud. Emergency responders faced an almost impossible task. Roads and bridges had been washed out, isolating many communities and delaying relief efforts. Local law enforcement, National Guard units, and volunteers worked tirelessly to rescue stranded residents, provide food, and establish temporary shelters. Hospitals and clinics struggled to treat injuries and prevent outbreaks of waterborne diseases, as contaminated floodwaters mixed with sewage and chemical runoff from damaged infrastructure. The small town of Wilford was entirely wiped off the map, while Sugar City and Rexburg were severely damaged, with buildings reduced to rubble and debris-filled streets. Even towns further downstream were affected, with property damage and flooding extending over 80 miles from the dam site. Power lines were downed, water supplies contaminated, and telecommunication networks disrupted, leaving thousands without basic utilities. Economically, the disaster caused damage estimated at up to $2 billion, accounting for both physical destruction and lost agricultural output. Beyond the financial toll, the emotional and psychological impact on the residents was profound. Families were torn apart, homes and livelihoods destroyed, and communities left to grieve the loss of friends, neighbors, and their way of life. The Teton Dam flood became a stark reminder of the consequences of engineering, miscalculations, and the devastating power of nature when human structures fail. In the wake of the Teton Dam disaster, investigators moved quickly to determine exactly why the structure had failed. An independent panel concluded that the collapse was caused by internal erosion, a process known as piping, in which water seeped through the dam's core, carrying away fine soil particles and progressively weakening the structure from within. The fractured volcanic rock beneath the dam had also contributed, as grout injections were unable to seal the foundation completely, allowing water to exploit cracks and fissures, The Bureau of Reclamation faced intense scrutiny for ignoring warnings from geologists and engineers about the site's unstable ground. Construction records showed that some precautions had been inadequately implemented, and risk assessments underestimated the potential danger of the lowest core eroding underwater pressure. The report prompted major reforms in dam safety practices nationwide, emphasizing thorough geological surveys, continuous monitoring, and the importance of redundancy in safety systems. The Teton Dam was never rebuilt. Today, the remnants of the structure remain a silent monument to the disaster, a reminder of both human fallibility and the tremendous forces of nature. The flood led directly to the creation of the Bureau of Reclamation's Dam Safety Program, which introduced stricter regulations for design, construction, and maintenance of all federal dams. These changes helped prevent similar tragedies and established a model followed worldwide for managing dam safety and risks. The environmental effects were long-lasting. Floodwaters scoured riverbanks, stripped soil from farmland, and deposited layers of debris that took years to remove. The Teton River ecosystem was disrupted, and habitats for fish and wildlife were devastated. Residents who survived faced the daunting task of rebuilding their communities and coping with the trauma of lost loved ones and destroyed homes. Ultimately, the Teton Dam disaster left a permanent imprint on Idaho and the engineering community. 11 people lost their lives, thousands were displaced, and billions of dollars in property and infrastructure were destroyed. Yet from this tragedy came critical lessons about geology, engineering, and human responsibility. The flood remains a cautionary tale of the risks of underestimating nature and the importance of vigilance, planning, and respect for the immense power of water.